Hello there and welcome back to the channel. Today I am doing a short video on a subject that I have previously stated in one or more of my videos that I wasn't going to touch on just yet, but recently I've had a lot of comments, which mostly I've ignored, but one or two I've had to respond to because, necessary. I was in a fighting mood. On basically the origins of Celts, or more accurately my use of the term. Now I'm going to explain this in brief and try to put it into terms that people understand. So I'll address the elephant in the room, which I keep getting people bringing up, and it's a fair point, and that is the Celts of Britain. Calling them Celts in the first place. Now this is going to upset some people, and I imagine I'll get more fighting in the comments over this. The Britons were not Celts, not exactly. But it depends on your definition of the term Celt. In modern terms, the Irish, the Scottish, some people in Wales, and yes, even some people in England identify their genetic and cultural ancestry as being Celtic. Now, this is not the majority of people, but many do. Now, whether this is wrong or right is not for me to say, it's not for you to say, but it is something to point out that it is through a modern lens that the prehistoric peoples of Europe, that is the people before the Romans conquered Western Europe, are generically referred to as Celts. This is through a modern lens. Now, this is modern people ascribing a term to people of the past. It's semantics, and people like things to fit into little boxes, and like this group of people with this group of people with that. It's not so simple. History is never so cut and dry. The Celts of Europe, the Celts of Britain, the Vikings, Eastern European cultures, West European cultures, the Carthaginians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Etruscans, all these cultures meld, they blend. There's overlap between many of them. For example, the origins of the term Celt is a little murky, but from what I understand, and from what I've heard as the best explanation, the term comes from the Greeks, who originally named the people of the north of them the Keltoi. The term became Celts. Now, the Romans generally refer to many people as Celts, but it is true the Romans never actually referred to the people of Britain as Celt. The reason I call them Celt is simply because in the last few centuries that's how they have been ascribed. Now, I'm trying to create a video list on a period of history that I find very interesting and is very mysterious, but it is not so easy to categorize it. Now, many people are more familiar with the term Celt. It's simply easier to refer to them as that. Now, it is true that there is an argument to be made that the people of Britain were neither Celtic nor connected to directly many of the other cultures of Europe, and that they were their own thing. That is again not so plain and simple. It's also true to say that many of the people are of Brythonic origin, but it is also true that Brythonic is Celt. So again, we're falling back on semantics. Now, I don't explain this in every video simply for the reason of it's not really worth going into. I'm having to do basically a full video on this, although not a very long one, just to explain this. Now, ascribing any name to these historical cultures is nothing more than a modern lens looking back and trying to see it and trying to categorize it and trying to put them into boxes in a way that we understand it and a map as that we understand it. For example, in Britain, as I said, there are certain peoples that identify as Celtic, and then the people of England generally don't because they are of Anglo-Saxon descent. But bear in mind, the Anglo-Saxons have not arrived in what is now England. The term England didn't exist. The Engles, the Engeland, the land of the Angles, had not begun to exist at this time in history, so therefore there was no England, there was no Wales, there was no Scotland. That didn't happen. But there was also no Britain, not in the strictest sense. There was a land known as Britain, but there was no British. There were no Britons. There was the Brigantes, the Silures, the Ordovicians, etc. These were peoples who inhabited the land of Britain may have called themselves British, we don't know. One thing I can probably say with a certain degree of certainty is no people in either Britain or Ireland at that time called themselves Celtic, which then brings me to the Irish calling themselves Celtic nowadays. It's not wrong for people of those nations to call themselves Celtic, but it is only a thing that has occurred in the last few centuries, because that's how people refer to those people from prehistory. The people of Wales, again, have a similar historical connection, as the Celts were spread west, pushed west by the Anglo-Saxon invasions, and they ended up in Wales, Cornwall, etc. They were pushed to the extremities. Now, history, again, that is the most brief, condensed version of those events. Of course, they are more complicated. Of course, there's more to them. Of course, it's not that simple, but that's, again, the same thing as what I'm saying. It's not as simple as to say they are or aren't Celtic. It's not simple to say they're Brythonic, they're of this origin. It doesn't matter. People moved all around Europe, and some of them were invaders. The Atrebates, for example, had territory in Europe and in Britain. They almost certainly were invaders. But cultures like the Brigantes didn't. But there were tribes with similar names. Now, I have stated before that the Celts, again, I'm going to keep the term because it's the simplest way to refer to the catch-all of the people from Eastern Europe and as far west as Spain, as far east as Germany and Austria, Switzerland, and as far north as Scotland, and even as far south as reaching into Italy and Greece at certain times. The Celts, for lack of a better term, were unified not by a racial identity, not by any particular concept of what we are or aren't, but by certain religious interests, certain artistic forms, such as the Latin form, which is the easiest one to say because it was the most modern, it's the most well known, which is all the swirly patterns you normally see. Latin style of art form and of a Celtic art was seen all across France, Germany, Switzerland, Britain, Ireland. It was embraced by everybody. Now, again, it's not so simple as to say it. Now, I'm sure there are people that are going to explain this to me in the comments, and by all means, if you have a different opinion, tell it me. If I'm wrong, I don't mind fessing up to being wrong. I like to think of this channel as a conversation starter. I'm trying to get people interested in the past, to understand that there is more to it. It's not looking at things that just happened in the last few hundred years, which I think some people are getting stuck on. They're getting stuck on a social and cultural linguistic divide within my land, Britain. See, I don't like necessarily to be called English. I am English, but I prefer the term British. This is because I don't like this, what I consider to be a very primitive notion of smaller nationhood. The idea of England died a long time ago when we unified, for better or for worse, with Wales and Scotland, and that is Britain. Now, there are plenty of arguments to say that, the English were bastards. But I wasn't. I didn't conquer Wales. I wasn't alive. I have ancestors that are actually half Irish on one side of my family. So my ancestors were also conquered by the English, as well as the other half probably being the conquerors. History is not so simple. The further back you go, the more people tend to blend. I've heard historical arguments to say that the Hittites were actually of a European origin. I don't know whether it's true or not, but I have heard people make that argument. And the Hittites were a culture that were nowhere near Europe, but they were supposedly or possibly descended from European migrants. It's just a theory that I read once, I believe, and then I saw it in a documentary. But it is just a theory. I don't believe it's ever been proven, but I'm not too sure. They would have been an Indo-European culture. That doesn't mean Celtic. But again, looking at how things are all connected, Vikings, in a way, as a culture, the people of Scandinavia are of course genetically and ancestrally linguistically different to Celts, but there's a lot of similarities in their cultures, enough to me to say there's some overlap. There were certainly trade connections, the beliefs in certain gods and religions. Germany had strong Celtic connections, and the Angles and the Saxons who came into England were German. And Denmark had Celts in it, and the Jutes came here from Denmark. So, where does this line on the map for everyone end? as Celtic and becoming something else. It doesn't matter to me whether they're called Celtic, Brythonic, Britain, Gaul, Germania, Hispania, anything. The original Celts, if you can call anyone the original Celts, probably, possibly started in sort of the Switzerland, that kind of area. But there are no ethnic Celts. People migrate around. A culture, a religion, a technology, art and language and belief systems were spread all across Europe, mostly sweeping westwards from the east in what we consider to be Celtic, forming other cultures as they went along. Now, these cultures were not all the same, but they were similar enough for historians to lump them all together, and that's the point. They're being lumped together. Yes, it was the Victorians who spread this stupid notion that they were primitives. Now, bear in mind, the Victorians at that time, the British Victorians, were off building an empire. And when you find things like the Battersea Shield, that looks quite impressive, but is still a primitive tool, we're off conquering cultures, still using that kind of technology in Africa and other such places. And we didn't want to think that our ancestors were like that. They try to identify with the Romans. So they sort of lump all these primitives together, as they see them, as one big culture, and they begin calling them Celts. Now the Irish, going back to them, trace their lineage directly and unbrokenly to the Celts of the past, to the ancient peoples of Hibernia and the other different amalgamations of people. Now, again, I go back to, as I said before, there were many people who moved around. So the Irish calling themselves Celtic is perfectly legitimate. But many people moved around. People from Britain fled, they spread south. They took ideas and concepts and technologies with them when they went. People from Europe came here. They brought technology and ideas here when they came here. For example, the body of a man who was found buried near Stonehenge. Stonehenge, by the way, not Celtic, it's pre-Celtic, it's much older than that. But this man had a copper dagger on him that was not made in Britain. It was found that the materials that went into making it were actually forged in Europe. Also, from the studies of his teeth, they know that this man travelled all over Europe and was, although he died in Britain, he was not born here, he was born on a continent. Now, to put this in another way, the way I see it, I agree on every level with even the people I've been arguing with occasionally that calling the ancient Britons Celts isn't entirely accurate. It's also not entirely accurate to call the people of Gaul Celt. We're looking at that through the lens of history and how we've been taught it by people that did this generations ago as just a simple way of boxing them all together. Now try to look at it like this. The Celts of Europe existed about 2,000 years ago, when Julius Caesar was bobbing about in Europe, about 2,000 years ago, conquering the Celts. Now we see them all as Celt. We don't see them as Atrebartes or Belgic or anyone like that. We don't name them like that. That's what they were called. But how many actual Celtic tribes can you rhyme off the top of your head? Now bear in mind, they were nation states. So how many can you name? It isn't many. I can't name them all. I can't even name all the ones in Britain off the top of my head. So, how many? So that's who they actually called themselves. So, who were the Celts? It's a good question. Now, jump forward. Look at this, the way we're looking at the past 2,000 years ago, lumping all these people together. Now, I'll use Britain as the analogy because Britain is the easier one for me. As I'm from Britain, I'm more aware of the cultural and political issues that exist between some of the former independent nations that make up this land of Britain. Travel forward in time from now 2,000 years. We don't know what the future is going to hold. For all we know, Britain is going to be conquered by the French in 100 years. And we'll all be speaking French, and English will be a fringe language only spoken on the borders of England. Maybe there's some place down in Kent that still speak a little bit of English. But French is now the first language. Maybe that's going to happen. The new French Empire is going to conquer all of Europe. Napoleon IV is going to rise, and yeah, there were beginnings of a 1,000-year French dynasty. Who knows? Might happen, might not, probably won't, but it might. Now, you're a historian 2,000 years from now. You might not be able to name England, Wales and Scotland. You might only know Britain. Hell, you may refer to everyone broadly as European. So when it is now taught in schools about the peoples that inhabited the lands of the French Empire 2,000 years ago, they were known as the Europeans. Is it wrong to call them that? No. Is it accurate? No. But it might just be as simple as you don't name them like that anymore. The names have been forgotten, the land of Britain has been renamed, and it's not referred to as Britain anymore. The city of London no longer exists. It's been replaced by several small towns. The capital is now, I don't know, Colchester. Colchester is now the capital, or Glasgow is now the capital. A great sprawling metropolis, ultra-modern. Very different to maybe how it is now. Who knows? We simply don't. Or it's some new settlement that doesn't exist yet. All these things are just people ascribing names to things. And by that point in time, it might not be relevant, the petty squabbles between little nations now that exist. They'll be forgotten and replaced by broader terms, because history is so vast and so complicated, it's not so easy to simply throw everything together into its constituent components. It's easier to throw it together into one big story, into one big name. And then you get people, because people are people and humans are human, they like things to fit into boxes. They like this nice, neat, linear progression of events that take them up to the modern age. And they think that the way they view it, and the way they view it now, is the way that it was always viewed. And that isn't true. That's never been true. I'm sure that the Romans believed that Latin will be the first language of Europe forever. How many people speak Latin? I'm sure there are some people watching this that do. I bloody don't. I can speak a few words in Latin. Not many. Most of them are picked up from films. Like Event Horizon, I learned Liberate tuta me ex inferis. Save yourself from hell. That's just because it's stuck in my head, because that film is amazing, by the way. Great movie. Sam Neill. Great film. Getting off topic. Anyway, as I said, I wanted to explain this because I wasn't really going to go into it, and I was trying to avoid it, and it's not something that's easy to explain in every video. So an apology to the people that feel I should. An apology to the people that feel somehow aggrieved by the fact that I don't mention in every video the social, cultural, genetic or linguistic ancestry of a particular group of people. As I've said, I'm not trying to build that. I'm trying to explain who they were, and beyond that, look into it yourselves. This fascinating, rich history of the whole world. The whole planet is fascinating and rich, and the thing is, most people don't know this, not because the information is not available, but in Britain it's not taught in the curriculum. And again, go forward 2,000 years, maybe in the curriculum people don't bother to talk about the English Civil War. They don't talk about the Angevin Empire. They don't talk about the British Empire, because we've been conquered by the French, and the French don't want to remember the British Empire because it would overshadow the fact of their great and glorious new empire. We want to go, oh, the British had an empire that was bigger than ours. We don't want to remember that. They're now a conquered country under us. We don't want to remember that one time they were richer and more powerful than us, that they defeated Napoleon. They don't want to remember Trafalgar, Waterloo. They don't want to remember that we saved them in World War II. They don't want to remember that. They want to remember the great and glorious conquest of Britain, its integration into the French Empire, the elimination of the concept of the British state and British patriarchy. That's what they want to remember, so it's no longer taught. So 2,000 years from now, that information may be available, but it's not standard information. So people are broadly referred to as European. Or some other name. Maybe the name Europe has been forgotten. In 5,000 years, how are we going to be viewed? Are we going to be remembered as a enlightened and advanced people? We might not. We might be remembered as one of the most violent eras in our history. The 20th century had more wars and more death than practically every century before it for 2,000 years. So, again, it is an apology. I don't want to miss out this information. My intention is not to offend people, or me to basically shit on what they consider to be their heritage or culture. And if I am, apologies. by all means correct me, but correct me with information that's accurate, not stuff that you have in your head viewed through a lens of the modern, infected by a modern concept of us versus them, of a cultural identity which didn't exist in the framing of the time period that we're talking about. I understand in Britain the English are not always well liked. I've spent some time in Wales and found that sometimes I encounter some bitterness. I've encountered people that refuse to speak to me in English because they don't want to. I once worked with I worked in retail, and I was closing a company called Netto that used to be in Britain. It left, and I was closing one of the stores, and working with me was a 16-year-old girl who happened to be from Manchester. Or she's 17, doesn't really matter. She was on a till anyway. And the moment the customers, who were talking to her quite pleasantly, asked her, "Oh, where are you from?" and she told them she was from Manchester, they instantly stopped talking to her and refused to speak to her in English any longer and started speaking to one another in Welsh. And I'm told by one of the people that worked there they weren't saying nice things. To me, that's pettiness and pathetic, and it may be deserved in the past, but Edward I conquered Wales like 700 years ago. It's horrible, it's nasty, but I'm not angry at the people of Normandy for 1066. I'm not angry at the Romans. I'm not angry at people from Scandinavia for the Viking Age, for the Danelaw, or, things of that nature. And we shouldn't be. We shouldn't carry that. And particularly when we should use history as a learning tool to learn from these mistakes, not remember the hate and all the anger, and try to remember that we're all people, and it's stupid to hate each other for the misdemeanors and crimes of generations that existed before us. To carry that forward is pathetic and stupid. And by extension, me referring to the ancient Britons as Celtic, back to my original point anyway, may or may not be entirely accurate. But it's not inaccurate, and it is also the most accessible way to explain who these people were to as broad an audience as possible, without me going into, well, actually there are Brythonic origins, and this particular people may actually have had connections to cultures in Spain. Now I do sometimes go into it, but I don't go into it in extreme detail, because it would simply take forever to do that, and especially considering I'm doing a breakdown tribe by tribe. I'm not trying to do it as a broad one. If I was doing a broad definition of who the ancient peoples of Britain were, then yes, I would talk about this. I would say, yes, we are from this area, this land. These people came here from this area and they conquered, and from there the culture and language spread. But I'm trying to show you who the individual peoples were. Again, by just referring to these people as the ancient Britons or as the Celts is giving them a disservice. That's not who they were. The Votadini were the Votadini. They weren't the Scottish, they weren't the Celts, they weren't the Britons, they were the Votadini. So any other name we give them is a name taken by people either now or from the last few hundred years who ascribe a term to them, again, to broadly understand who they were and try to put them into a nice neat little box. Not that simple. It simply isn't. There's a reason Brittany in France is called Brittany, because people from here went there and they conquered it or they absorbed it in some way. There's equally a reason why French and other languages are sort of absorbed into our languages, where there are place names that are of Roman and other such origins within Britain and all across Europe, because there's been an amazing melding of these cultures for thousands of years. The people here did not evolve in a vacuum. Yes, they were apart from the people in Europe, but also the Brythonic people that came here and brought Celtic culture with them didn't invent it. They brought it from somewhere else, or it was brought to them by someone else, which is more likely. There are no ethnic Celts. If you look at genealogy, it's all over the place. So, certainly if you look back over just a few centuries, it's all relatively local. But you go back over thousands of years, it's not. People were constantly in a state of motion, for whatever reason. This video has ended up a lot longer than I wanted it to. I've ended up ranting and rambling. This is simply because, and don't take this as an attack, I'm not trying to attack the people that have commented and have made these points to me. Because I've had it several times. Since I've been doing this channel, I've had people message me and I've had loads of comments on this subject. And for the most part, I either agree or I've stated in videos. I'm not going to go into it simply because it will take too long. This video, looking at my timer, has taken me 25 minutes already. Now, if I was to do this in every single video, all of my videos would be about an hour long. So, apologies if I'm not including it, or you think I'm ignoring it, or you think I'm being a typical arrogant Englishman and just going, blah, your ancestry doesn't matter. It does matter. Your beliefs matter. But what you believe and what is true don't have to be the same thing. And I just want to make that clear, that I'm not trying to detract from the accomplishments of your ancestors or anything else. It's simply the easiest way to access the information to as broad an audience as possible without going into this level of detail. Once people are interested in the subject, they can learn about it on their own. People are smart, people are clever. And with the internet, there's so much access, and there are far smarter people doing videos like this. On YouTube, probably on Vimeo. Don't go on Vimeo, but it probably is on there as well. Etc. Now, as I said, this video has drained, then gone on long and long and long, and I only intended it to be about 10 minutes long, and it's already more than double that. So I'm going to leave it at that, and rip me to pieces in the comments. Don't really care. But that's the reason I use the term Celt, and why I don't go into the actual ancestral origins of the individual peoples broadly, because it's simply too big a subject to cover. It probably needs its own series. It's not so easy to simply say this is what happened. It's also, a lot of the information that I have in and of itself is contestable, because every tribe, every event, but we're talking about prehistory, can be contested. There's more than one viewpoint. There's a reason why archaeologists and historians will sometimes say, oh, that's ritual, because they don't really know what it was for. They dig something up and go, well, they buried that like that because ritual. They built it like this because ritual, because they don't know. And there's so much of it we don't know because it's not recorded. It's BC, it's prehistory in Britain and Europe, and they didn't write anything down. Everything was passed on through oral tradition, and that was mostly through the Druids, who were wiped out. That history is lost. We're piecing it together through archaeology and external sources, such as the Romans, who can't be trusted with information, because they were the biggest abusers of the written word. They didn't write things down accurately. They did everything to make themselves look better. They were trying to describe the peoples of Europe as being primitive and in need of Roman civilizing. They referred to them broadly as Celtic. The Romans influenced the Victorians, and the Victorians and the few generations before them actually continued to refer to people from prehistory as Celtic for reasons which are relevant to their time period and their outlook on the world. And that's how we've got to this point. We're still stuck in that mindset. And I'm trying to show these people as not primitive. They weren't primitive. They weren't stupid, ignorant savages like they've tried to be shown in history. They were intelligent, wonderful people with a culture, an art, a language, religion, beliefs, and history all of their own, far older than anything we have now. And it's a great tragedy that that culture has been destroyed. Although fragments of it may live on the fringes of Europe, it's never going to be back. The Druid religion, in its original form, is never going to re-exist. It's never going to exist again. True Celtic culture will never exist because, for a start, in Ireland, there's where probably the strongest Celtic veins flow. There's been too much influence from us, Northern Ireland in particular. There's also linguistic, cultural and religious changes that have taken place there over the last millennia that are so serious, so drastic, that it's probably destroyed much of that ancestry, which is maybe why some of them cling to it so fiercely. I have an Irishman who's a friend of mine. He's a Mormon, but he actually loves and embraces his ancient Irish history, and he once told me that one of the things he doesn't like about the English, he likes the English individually, but as a nation, as a state, he didn't like them, and he couldn't get past it, even though he lives in England and has an English wife. Another story for an argument with him. But he once told me he doesn't dislike the English as individuals, but what he doesn't like is he can't speak his own language. He speaks English, he doesn't speak Irish. He can't speak his own language. There's nothing stopping him from learning it, but it is harder to access it. So I understood that was the best way he could explain it to me, and he's fascinated by his history as well, those ancient peoples and who they were. But in some ways he blames the English for their destruction when it wasn't necessarily us. But that is a much longer and complicated story that people have literally fought wars over, and is not worth going into, in my opinion, right now. But that him phrasing it to me like that made me understand why. It put it in a context I could understand as to why he dislikes the English as a whole, and why many people around the world have an issue with English culture. It's imperialistic. I get that. But the more we hold on to it, the longer it'll stay and the longer it won't go away. Alright, now this video really has gone on too long, so I'm going to end it. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you for watching. Tell me your thoughts in the comments below, and I'm not going to do such a heavy video in future. I'm going to go back to just my nice normal stories about the ancients, which I'm about halfway through the ancient tribes now, and yeah, should be able to bring that main series to a close and then start on all the fringe stuff I've been looking forward to doing as well. So hope you come back for them, and check out my other channels as well, which are linked in the description below, and come argue with me in the comments on those too. It's all good fun. You made it all to the end. Thank you for watching, and bye bye.